Today on Paralysis to Purpose.
It was really a time for us to kind of show, okay, who are Sikhs?
Yeah.
Let's show the world who Sikhs are, because we can't let the act of a white supremacist, neo-Nazi, skinhead be the lasting message.
Yeah. Here we go. You can do anything you put your mind to. What seems impossible can be done by you. It may knock you down, but don't let it stop you. Got so much to give, a lot of life to live. You must go from paralysis to purpose.
This is Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast with David Cooks.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. I tell you what, I say this every time because it's the truth. I love what I do because I get to have a conversation with some of the most intriguing and influential and inspirational people in the world. And today is no exception. You're really going to enjoy this podcast today. So thank you in advance for sharing this podcast, liking this podcast, leaving a review, and subscribing for our newsletter. On August 5th, 2012, a gunman walked into a temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. He murdered 7 people, and then he killed himself. Our guest today lost his father and members of his community on that day. Pardeep Kaleka is the co-author of the book, The Gift of Our Wounds. He's the executive director of Interfaith Conference here in Milwaukee. He is a trauma clinician, a well-known speaker, and known as a global peacemaker. I tell you what, I am so glad that to have him here today. His story is amazing. So Pardeep, welcome to Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast.
You know, first off, I just want to say, man, it's great to be on with you, David. You are definitely, I think, you know, for a lot of people, I can speak for the vast majority of people, that you are their hero, and we look up to you and for leadership, guidance, inspiration, and you know, just want to encourage everybody to make sure that they go out, get David's book, and it's Getting Undressed, right?
Yeah, it's Getting Undressed from Paralysis to Purpose. I remember when I first met you, and you were talking about Juneau High School and basketball, and how you were a great player, and I'm like, do Indian people play basketball? Now, I know I'm not supposed to say that, but that's what I was thinking. And immediately I had to catch myself and say, okay, this guy has made inroads on many fronts, including that. And you're not wearing your turban right now. You're not, you know, so that day really opened up a lot for me to start to understand a lot more that I didn't know. So let's go back to that day, and let's talk about how you eventually got to the place of, first of all, dealing with the tragedy of the day, with the loss of the day, with the significance of that for you and your family. And then more importantly, what you did after that and how you were able to go from that place of hurt to forgiveness, and then the stuff that you do now.
Yeah, no, thank you, David. And yeah, again, it's an honor to be on with you and really just talking about that day. But I remember our first conversation as well, just thinking about, all the stereotypes that we do have of different people, and then going on that journey with them. But also it's a journey for ourselves too. You know, whenever we journey with someone else, you know, we're holding hands with ourselves. And so that day, August 5th, you know, I lost my father, who was a temple president at the Sikh Temple, and then 6 other people who were killed by an affiliated white supremacist. And I think that it's important to say that because of what is happening right now. And we'll talk a little bit about what is happening right now, as that you're seeing a lot of unaffiliated people carry out shootings against minority communities, against other people, against women. And while some of this might seem randomized, it's not as random as we think. And it's set up in a way to terrorize communities. And when that happened on that day, I was just dedicated to saying our community will not be terrorized. We will not fall prey to being victims. We will tell the world who we are. And I think that was really my charge personally, was to say, okay, we need to heal as a community internally. But after we do that, we need to get out in the broader community and teach people who we are, what we stand for, and what our beliefs and faith stands for. And I think that, that shooting that day brought us back to the reality of what we probably should have stood for when we first came to this country. Sikhs have long stood for social justice. Since the conception of Sikhism, we've been all about equality, all about justice, all about reform. And somehow, some way, this American experience made us forget that and say, oh, well, we're about making money now. We're about gaining whatever it means to gain to achieve the American dream, while also maybe we might be losing something that we should have held on to. And so when the shooting happened, it was really to say, how can you reclaim that? And I don't think that's unique to Sikhs. I think that is within all communities. It is their responsibility to go back and take whatever it is that they were supposed to be, whoever they were supposed to be. That's a difficult thing to do. There's a difficult conversation to have. But I think that when we're talking about the sense of purpose as we go forward, that's really our purpose. We have an individual purpose for sure. But we also have a communal purpose to come back and say, what have we lost in America because of who we wanted to become? And why do we need to go back right now and go reclaim our ancestral heritage, our uniqueness, whoever we are, right? And say, as we go forward, I want to bring forward my entire self, and I want other kids to follow and say, I'm proud of who I am.
You said a couple of things that I find very interesting as an African-American. And you talked about healing yourself first and then sharing with others who you are. Can you just share a little bit of the process of healing within and then reaching without?
Yeah, no, David, that's a great question. And really, I think it is that way. If we genuinely want to heal, we do have to foremost come back to self a lot more than we go out. And we're great at, as a society, we're great at looking out of the window, right? We do it all the time. They're going through this, that person's wrong by doing this. We're great at looking out of windows, but we suck at looking in the mirror. And the healthiest thing that we need to do is, and I'm not saying let's neglect the window, let's neglect the world. I'm saying that, as you look at yourself twice, look once outside the window. So it needs to be proportionate, and then say we can do this work at the same time, but also understand that the work that you're doing is having an effect on you. And for that day, I was about 10 minutes away from the temple when the shooting started. And the thing that saved us was really my daughter forgetting her notebook at the house and us having to turn around. And so what that day taught me was, and then I wrestled with two feelings right away. Both my mom and dad were inside the temple at the time. My mom survived. She hid inside of a closet from the shooter. My dad obviously didn't survive. He took 5 shots. But what stood, what the feeling that really was overwhelming that day was survivor's guilt and survivor's relief. I was with my 2 children at the time, and I was relieved that as a father, I didn't have to go save them from a crazy gunman who was going to kill everybody in sight. And I was relieved of that. But then I was guilty because I dedicated my life to, at that time, policing, teaching, serving community. And I felt like I wasn't doing enough. And I felt frustrated that we weren't doing enough as a country to be more welcoming of immigrants and religious minorities and the Black community and all communities that were being marginalized at the time. I didn't feel like we were doing enough. But as much as I had to ask myself, well, are you doing enough? And that's a real moment of reflection of maybe you need to stop looking out and look inward and say, maybe we're not doing enough. And it took me a while to kind of come back and say, okay, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. I want to dedicate it to preventing hate crimes like this from happening to anybody else. And I didn't know that God, and sometimes God's the spirit, whatever it is much bigger than I can ever explain it to be. Right. But something was pushing me to say, okay, this is where your purpose lies. You're going to keep going forward. And then, I didn't know that I was going to find my purpose in what happened that day or where we went forward, but it was very much a personal journey of healing and a communal one.
Wow. So, I think a lot of times our purpose is birthed in pain. And we would rather have that not be the case. I think if I tell people all the time, we don't get to choose necessarily the road of adversity that we're going to be on, but we do get to choose how we respond to that. And your response, I think, is just amazing. Over the last 9 years, 10 years, almost a decade now, have you seen a change in that, in how your community is perceived and received?
Yeah, I'm seeing, David, I'm seeing a change starting to happen with that. And I say that post 9/11, some of the first victims after 9/11 who received a lot of the sort of the community backlash were Sikhs. And a lot of them were turban wearing Sikhs. In this country, most of the people that you will see, I would even give it a number, maybe like 90%, who wear turbans are going to be Sikhs. I'm not wearing a turban right now. I sometimes wear turbans to weddings or funerals or religious occasions, but not every Sikh wears a turban all of the time. Some Sikhs wear turbans all of the time, but most of the people that you will see in this country who do wear a turban will be Sikhs. And so, but not to say that those are the only Sikhs.
Right.
There's a lot of non-turban wearing Sikhs. So I think that after 9/11 happened, Sikhs started to get to be known. But as far as I think really 2012 opened up people's eyes to who Sikhs were, because part of that was now you had this white supremacist who was ex-military, right? Who did the shooting, who caused the shooting. And the message was at that time, Barack Obama was running for his second term as president. Many people were calling it a post-racial society at that time. Now, 2021, we're like, oh my God, we were just so naive, right? But there were some people who were advertising the United States to be a post-racial society at that time. And what that moment told in history was we have a lot of work to do. Here was this immigrant class who moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and at that time were creating their American dream, only to be told that they weren't allowed this American dream, that somehow, some way, it wasn't meant for them. And how many people in the United States right now are being told the same thing, right? Are being told the same thing. Yeah, we advertised this American dream, but it was really not meant for your people. It was actually meant for a specific kind of people. And we have to be honest with that history to do something about it, right? Truth and reconciliation. Truth comes first before reconciliation.
Let's say that statement one more time. You said truth comes first before reconciliation.
Truth comes, in this country, we gotta be honest with that truth. So for us, it was really a time for us to kind of show, okay, who are Sikhs?
Yeah.
Let's show the world who Sikhs are, because we can't let the act of a white supremacist, neo-Nazi skinhead be the lasting message.
That's right. That's right. Because that would have been the final association of many people with the Sikh community.
Exactly.
And that's not what it is at all.
Exactly.
At
exactly.
All.
And part of this is honest, like I saw a lot of children inside of our temple walls who were also kind of hurting, but didn't know how they were hurting. Mm-hmm. And part of them wanted to stay behind that safe wall. And me being out in community and kind of, even as I reached out to Arnold, who's a former white supremacist who started that same gang, part of that inspiration was to say, you know what, I can't let you exist in trauma. Right. Yes, you're okay. Like, you said earlier, like we would have been fine to be upset. We would have been fine to be mad, disgruntled, or even, existing in our trauma. But that's not freedom. That's not forgiveness. That is, that is like, that's exactly what the shooter wants us to do.
You talked about reaching out to Arno, who we're going to have on the podcast at some point, and then the both of you together. You reached out to a white supremacist to help you navigate through this tragedy. That's unique. I mean, I don't know anyone who would have gone through that experience and went and tried to reach out to someone who used to be a part of that to help on this journey. How did you come up with that? How did you think back to it?
Yeah, I think back to it right now, and I really do think that God's hand was placed on all of us. Mm-hmm. And I think that sadness is not necessarily a bad thing that happens to us, and happiness is not something good that happens to us. Mm-hmm. I think sadness is a state of being where you see the clues in life and yet you neglect them. Happiness is basically you see the clues in life and you follow them. And so you get to a place where you're following this guided hand. And I hate to say that, like, tragedy and pain and all of these things help you get there, but they do, and they did. And 3 months after the shooting happened, I reached out to him because I wanted answers. Right? And I can say that now. I wanted answers. I wanted some closure. I knew that part of me was also kind of like, 3 months into it, I was doing my best for this community who didn't want to come outside of their sanctuary walls. And I was getting fatigued. I was tired, because when you're fighting against the community outside, right? A culture of what white supremacy looks like. And then internally, you're also fighting with the people that, you call family, right? You get fatigued. You're like, oh my God, I can't fight on all fronts. I can't fight for you and against you at the same time. So part of me reaching out, and the shooter in this situation, for those that don't know, killed 7 people, and then he took his own life. So that's what's called a mass murder suicide. So that's exactly what happens in a lot of these situations, where somebody carries out and kills a lot of people before they take their own life. So with him went the exact motive, went the what happened. So when I reached out to Arno started the same organization that the shooter belonged to. And what I wanted to know was, did he know him? Did he recruit him? Did he train him? Did he brainwash him? Did he know what he was going to do before he did it? So all of these things, I wanted to get all of these answers. By the time that I met Arno, he was reformed, but he was still very early on in this process of reforming. And there's a whole process that even happens right there. And with Arno, you can talk about, forgiveness on what that looks like, a self-forgiveness, right? Of like being part of this ideology and then trying to escape it. And then on just the tanglements that come with all of that. It's an ideology of who you have to give your life to. When he was going through it, he'll tell you this, but it was like every moment that you would experience kindness or niceness, or somebody of a different color treating you like a human being, you had to separate yourself from. You had to actively do something to make sure that people would not humanize you of different skin complexions, because you wanted to continue that narrative in your head that it's us against them. And every moment that kind of talks about multicultural kindness and people getting along was something that would chip away at that ideology. And this is kind of what we talked about the first time that we met, but deeper than that was really, here I was looking for an explanation on why, what happened, and all of these things. And what I gained was an experience. So when we think about this, a lot of times in our society, in America, we lead with our head and our heart follows, right? So we're anchored to our head. We're anchored to this head that tells us all about judgment, all about what somebody should do or what we'll do, right? This head part, and then our heart follows. What we need to start to do is start to anchor it, as you said, and you know, for us, we're both people of faith,
right?
So when we talk about the heart needs to lead, right? We're talking about God needs to lead, right? We're talking about the Spirit needs to lead, and then the head follows, right? Because if you're anchored in this heart work, and what happened the first time that I saw him, and you know, and I thought that I was anchored to the heart work, even when I first met him, right? But what he taught me in that moment of like, and when, you know, our first conversation was one of empathy, where, you know, I hurt my eye, and he's you know, asking me about what happened to you, and here I was looking for explanations on the shooter, the motive, the this, that. Here he was also being guided by mind work, right? But by like, what am I going to say to him? And then all of a sudden there were just two men who like we're talking, and we're just talking from the heart, right? And when hearts talk, hearts listen. When minds talk, minds listen. So when we're doing this purpose work, right, we have to go forward and say, you know what? As important as the explanation is, it is important, but the experience of brotherhood, that's over everything. That is over everything. So now you have two men, you know, one man from a different walk of life, one man. We're sitting here just two. The world will see us as two men who are, you know, more alike than more unlike than we are the same.
Right.
But we're like, no, I'm telling you right now, David would probably continue the sentence I'm about to say, because he gets this purpose God work, right?
This is a great place for us to take a quick break. And when we come right back, we're going to dive right into what you're doing now.
We hope you're enjoying Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Paralysis to Purpose for more updates. Also, check out David's website at davidcookspeaks.com to learn more about his mission and purchase his book, Getting Undressed, From Paralysis to Purpose.
Welcome back to Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast, with our guest, Pardeep Kaleka. So now you are an executive director of Interfaith for the Greater Milwaukee. How did you come into that position? What does that mean? What are you guys doing that is tied to your purpose individually?
So over the years, and this is over 9 years since the shooting happened itself, I've traveled from East Coast, West Coast, right, north to south, and really to different mass shooting sites, meeting different families. And the families are all over the place because the incidents are kind of all over the place, you know, from Newtown, from 7-year-olds being shot in their classroom, right, and killed, to West Coast, to churches, to synagogues, to masjids, to schools, universities, to inner city violence, to all of that, right? And just seeing a lot of death, and along with that, grief. Mm-hmm. And what we've tried to do is always kind of make sure that the healing part is part of that grief process.
Okay.
So this is working with these survivors' families, working on advocacy, policies, trying to keep people safe, however that looks like, right? Against domestic terrorism, foreign terrorism, all kinds of threats of violence, right? Targeted violence. And what I've come to kind of conclude is that faith is always a big part of the healing process. It always is, whether you can name it, whether it's theistic or not, whether it's something that you believe in, you say, well, I don't believe in any faith at all. I think that we are all people of faith. You know, I don't think it's just reserved for the clergy or for those that are ordained. But I think that if you know that tomorrow can be better than today, you are all people of faith. I learned this from, you know, when I was working as an educator with high school, at what the state labeled at-risk high school youth, right? And I would see children, and you know this because you worked with children, you worked with high schoolers yourself. And so it's like, you know the situations that child is going through. You know some of the heartache that child feels. And when Monday morning comes up and, Mr. Cooks asks him for homework, and this person comes up and gives you his homework, is that not a person of hope? Is that not a person of faith? Does that person not know that, hey, as tragic as my personal situation is at home, mom and dad are hurting each other, but here I go giving Mr. Cooks this homework because I know in a couple of years from now I'll be graduating from high school and then going to college, and then I'm going to go and I'm going to fight against the injustices that kept me feeling like I wasn't powerful enough at that time. Mm. And so we are all people of faith. And why interfaith is that I saw a lot of people working with different clients, sexually abused, hurt, men coming out of jail, deferred prosecution agreements. And I saw them and I asked them, I said, how does faith lead your life? And oftentimes they would say, well, it doesn't. I said, well, why doesn't it? And then they would reply and say, well, because when I look into a church or when I look into a religious place, I don't want to go in there. And I said, why? And because I don't feel like I'm worthy. I feel then oftentimes they would say, well, the harm that has been put upon me, I feel like I wouldn't be worth going up to God or in their eyes. And I was like, man, you should be the first person. Right. You should be in the front pew.
Right.
You should be the life lesson that whole congregation needs. Because as you said, faith is only real when you participate in it.
Right.
It can't be prescriptive. Somebody can't just tell you what it feels like. You got to go through it. I mean, we can try, right? We can talk to people, and say, but somebody right now is going through it right now. Mm-hmm. They're going through it. They lost their lives. They lost their livelihoods, lost their relationships. Somebody's going through it. And when that person participates in that relationship with whatever God looks like to them, right? I want to make sure that person is in the front of the pews, sitting up there and saying, hey, listen, I was always worth it. Mm-hmm. God never turned their back to me. I turned my back to God. And all this is me returning back where I was supposed to be. And so I wanted to make it where that would be the reality of all faith and faith leaders, to say, what role do you play in healing? I need you to get outside of your walls and go flag that person down on Burleigh, right? On 16th, right. At the chapel. Go outside. Don't wait for them to come inside. Go outside and invite them in, because that's going to be your most dedicated parishioner.
Wow, that is very powerful. You talked a little bit indirectly about perspective and the importance of how you see, in that last example, how you see yourself and that type of stuff. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of perspective as you go on the journey from a traumatic experience and how you have to maybe shift your paradigm or shift your thinking to maybe see it differently, and how that does that help?
Yeah. From the clinical perspective, I'm also a trauma clinician. What isn't talked about and what needs to be talked about a bit more is trauma looping. And so a trauma-based reality, and how some people, and you see this on social media, you see it in person, when a person is telling you the same story over and over and over again, that person is actually trauma looping. We might not be attuned to it because we're like, okay, let's put this, we want to respect this person's story, right? When a person is on social media and they're talking about the same thing all the time, no matter what the subject matter is, they're actually trauma looping again. They just don't know they're doing it. So when that was happening, it was really important for me to slow it down and say, okay, slow this down, because you're starting to loop. You're starting to say the same thing. And now let's be creative and let's take some of this apart. And so, yeah, it is very much a paradigm change of lens shifting, to say, just kind of not in a toxic way, but David, in like a productive way, if you lovingly challenge yourself, right? And I will say that Arno played a really big role in that, right? Because now you have a person who is he's part of that harm. So I think within the relationships that we have in the world, if we're going to get out of this trauma loop of racism, of violence, we will need the entire community to come together as a village and say, okay, let me lovingly challenge you out of it, not toxically.
That's right.
Not invalidate your feelings, but make you kind of like, okay, like what does that feel like, and what does that look like? And so, yeah, part of it was that, and family played a big role in that. Obviously, family always does. Your nearest, dearest, right?
Right.
Your children, your community, your faith, all of that plays a big role in that. And I think sometimes we think about hearts that listen. Sometimes the most important heart to listen to is your own.
It's your own. I want to talk to you about Indianapolis. A few weeks ago, we had a mass shooting, and some Sikh people were targeted in that shooting. And then also about what's happening in India at the time of this recording. They are experiencing record cases and deaths of COVID like we've never seen. And I know that you're originally from Punjab, India, and I don't know if you've got relatives there and how, but let's talk about a little bit of that. Secondly, first, let's go back to the shooting down in Indianapolis and the work that you do. It's interesting. I heard some statistic that since the beginning of the year to now, there have been like some 50 mass shootings or something, some crazy number. We don't hear about them all because they're not all broadcast on the media. That's a really high number.
Yeah, it is a high number. And if you go back, depending on how you define a mass shooting, some people define it as 4 more people being shot. Mm-hmm. So other people will define it as 4 more people being shot and killed outside of the shooter, right? So the longer you get with the definition, the less the numbers of mass shootings. But if you just said, okay, 4 more people being shot, right, which is that's bad, that's tragic.
Yes.
Right. And in 2020, last year, we would have had 600 mass shootings, more than one a day. And so there's a part of us that's being so conditioned and normalizing mass murder to the point that it's like we're the frog boiling in this water that can't jump out and can't make decisions and really can't change policy, but it's happening everywhere. So I think that, that while this would have been 20 years, 30 years ago, you didn't have the scale. And I fear that if we don't do something now, we'll have 1,000 mass shootings a year. We'll have 3 a day in the United States. That will get to a place that this is just so normalized. And, what happened in Indianapolis was tragic. That, you have a 19-year-old who, and let's call it what it is. I mean, 19-year-old white male. A lot of times it is white males that carry out a lot of these shootings. 98%, it's a male. So we also have to talk about the way that men are prone to externalizing violence and harm. So I think all of those things need to be talked about. But yeah, the community in Indianapolis, I've been in touch with them. They are doing some of the same things that we did as far as like putting a brave face on for the world, trying to heal internally while also working with the community. Interfaith communities are coming together to pray for them. But I think what we can do as a society is to just really just commit ourselves to not making it normal. And saying, yeah, somehow we owe it to our children. We owe it to future generations to say, okay, we did what we needed to do, and we didn't leave this problem as just a problem for you all to solve. And I think that we need to do that with other things. Some of the most pressing are obviously health disparities that are happening within this country, violence that is being directed towards people, and I think global climate concerns that we have. Yeah.
There's obviously mental health seems to be at the forefront of a lot of some of these violent attacks that people are dealing with things mentally. And COVID has paralyzed everybody and has in one form or another. and has affected people mentally in one form or another, if they're honest about it. I can tell you, the last 18 months in November of 2019, I thought I had the flu, and I went to the emergency room, and it was sepsis. And so I've had to deal with surgeries and other things over the last year and a half. And I came off bed rest just in time for COVID to be in place or in shelter. That was difficult mentally. I'm used to talking to people. I love to hug people, go places, do things, be independent. And that was gone. Public speaking and all that was gone. How am I going to, I'm a man. I need to help my wife and make sure we're supporting the family, all that kind of stuff. So I understand. I was grateful I had enough faith in me at the time. And I had some great friends and stuff that I could talk to help me get through some of those low moments. Can you address a little bit the mental health aspect of what's going on and maybe what you think might be some solutions or ideas to help with that?
Yeah, I think, David, just thinking about the mental health, I think about it differently than I think a lot of people within the clinical world would think about it. And mental health has been changing over the years. We were stuck in this kind of model of diagnosis. Now we understand it much more of a communal effect of mental health. And you pointed out everything that's sort of like, okay, like I'm feeling this and I'm feeling that I should be, doing this for my family. And I don't feel like if I can't do this, then I lose some, and it's such a personal issue that I think thinking about communities and what we can do about this as we go forward is we need to bring back the village. And that has gone by the wayside. When I first came to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, this is 1982, we still had a village appeal. I mean, it was starting to leave because jobs were starting to leave, because other ways of making money were entering into what Milwaukee felt like, right? But even in the 1980s, Milwaukee still had that feel of like the village. And you knew that if you cut up or your children cut up, that somebody else would say something to them and say, okay, hey, young man, I know that your parents wouldn't want you doing that, right? When I was an educator for 12 years, right, I worked with what the state would label at-risk high school youth. But my approach was always, hey, I'm part of the village. I'd call mom and dad first couple of weeks, or I'd call grandma, whoever the caretaker was, and start to get to know their name by heart. And so then when Johnny was cutting up in class, I'd be like, hey, your grandma, Patrice would not like that. You know that. You wouldn't do that in front of her. And now this kid is like, man, how does Mr. Kaleka know my grandma Patrice? But right. It would be something that would be sticking in their heart and be like, oh, he knows that because he cares enough to know that. And while I might not want him to know that, I know that he does. So I'm not going to cut up in his class. And somehow, some way, over time, part of this is social media. Part of this is the distancing of people. Part of this is the product of segregation. Everything put together, right. We have lost the village.
I think that is a great point. And I'll let you finish it, because I was listening to someone this morning who's a friend of mine, and he's a conservative talk show host, an African-American conservative talk show host. And we don't see eye to eye on everything. But he was talking about the breakdown of community in African-American communities, that old same thing you talked about, where the families didn't have to be always intact back in the day, but your community was. And your community was there for you, even if your father wasn't in the home or your mother wasn't in the home. You had a single parent home, but you had a community that was around you that helped you to understand what was right and what was wrong and what the expectations were. And as we look at these homicide rates going up all over the country, I think it's time to have this conversation that we're having right now about restoring the village, about bringing back accountability, about bringing back standards that will help us to achieve. Because quite honestly, it's not, police brutality is a problem, but it's not the problem. systemic racism is a problem, but it's not the problem. I think that we've got to get to the core of this, and I think this restoring the village is spot on.
And you're right. These are manifestations of the bigger problem, but it's something that society thinks and it can almost absolve themselves of saying, okay, you know what? I'm fighting for this cause or I'm fighting for that cause. Well, you don't know what the village should look like for that community. You're just assuming, and the only people that know what that village should look like are the people from that village. So just like a body heals internally, so do communities. And so how do you come out from and yes, I think putting a Band-Aid on the problem and saying, you know what, the external community should do that, should hold cops accountable, should work on systemic racism, should work on all of these other issues. But the bigger problem here, and one that we're not discussing, is the breakdown of family, is the breakdown of that. And that's been happening so long. That's been happening so long that it's such a deep ancestral wound that people don't even know why it is that they're turning away from God or faith or the family or the village, is because they don't know themselves. Mm-hmm. They're trying to figure it out. So they're prone to all of these impenetrable sort of like outside forces playing on that void and saying, hey, let me fill this void for you. Again, the only person that can fill that void is themselves, to come back and say, hey, listen, I need to go back and revisit the story of my ancestors. Yes. Right? I need to come back and I need to listen to grandma talk about what that felt like so that I can have that nourishment from a real place.
And I do think you're absolutely right. It starts with rekindling the family and whatever that is going to look like, and then go forward with that. I mean, that's
whatever it's going to look like. I had a conversation a while back with 4 Black young men, and we were doing a program, and I started to talk to them about like just the ancestors and something, and all of them were like, yeah, I feel it. There's something there. And there's something there. I can't, they didn't know how to articulate it, mm-hmm. but I was like, okay, yeah, you know what? Just understand that, and understand in times when you feel alone, you're never really alone. Mm. That it's there, and keep nourishing that part. And when you're, like when you're in moments in crisis and when you feel like you're about to do something, listen to that part, because that part is ancestral wisdom that nobody's going to be able to give to you but you. It is our intuition. It is our gut reaction. It is like, no, I don't want to do this.
Right.
The forces that exist outside of us that won't go into that discussion, can't go into the discussion, right, are manipulating a lot of these kids to make them think that what their worth is somehow tied up in, getting that. It's like, no, your worth is just tied up in you listening to that part of you, that small flicker, right, which is going to grow if you just nourish it.
Wow, that's excellent. One last thing, and it's interesting. As I thought about this, and before we started our conversation today, I was talking about India and the tragedy of COVID, and it's interesting that I would ask you that, and we live in such a sensitive time now. And I was like, I wonder if that was racially insensitive for me to ask him about his concern about India. But I'm asking him originally where he's from, how is this impacting his family? Because sometimes I just want to know, because you're originally from India, and I don't know what to do. We need to try to help. And I didn't know if you had any insights or anything about the COVID in India is deep.
Yeah, I was having this discussion with somebody, and I was just talking about health disparities in this country, and kind of talking about health disparities in India. India is still, if there's 300,000 cases per day, right, new cases, and if there's 300,000, I would be willing to bet that there's at least 500,000. So I think you can safely say that if 300,000 people are able to get to a test in India, that there's probably a whole bunch of people who are never really getting tested, who are coming down with COVID. And I would, like 500,000 is pretty reasonable in a country that has 1.3 billion people. So, I think that they got some real issues that they need to, as far as like politically, just where they are, they came out of lockdown prematurely and celebrated, I think, a little bit too early. And as that started to happen, people started to gather at weddings and religious events and political rallies. So I think that our heart breaks for those families. We had our family had plans to go to India at the end of this year and visit some family there, but our family contacted us from India and just kind of said, don't bring your family. Here's what's going on. And shortly, like right after that, the news started to come out about all of those cases that are just skyrocketing. I do think that, I pray for India. I pray for, I'm still from that dirt. I'm still from that place, right? You still feel it. It's still close enough to be considered and say, you know what, this is my motherland. This is what gave birth to a boy named Pardeep in a small farming village, right? And but I don't think that's. I want you to be able to say that. And we all trace our roots back.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I wanted to have that exchange because I want people to understand that. If it's okay, you know what, you got to go for it. And if you have a relationship with people, they will guide you through how to cover things and how to speak about things and what's offensive and what's not offensive. I guess one of the things that challenges me in this day and age that we live in is that it's almost like I'm not allowed to determine what offends me. I need to be offended by what everybody else says I need to be offended by. Can I just be an individual and learn and grow? And if something doesn't offend me, it doesn't mean that I'm not supporting the community. That's not what that means. It just means I'm not offended by it. I think those are conversations too that I think we've got to begin to have in order to move forward on some things.
Within America, it's saying, okay, is an organization, is an individual, are you culturally competent? Now, when you bring in the word competency, it automatically assumes that it has something to do with intelligence, right? And what we really need to start to get to is, are you culturally humble? Is there a sense of cultural humility? So then we get away from saying, okay, well, you don't know about it, therefore, and intelligence, again, this is mind work, right?
Right.
Where we're anchored to the mind and saying, well, if somebody doesn't know enough about this, then they must not be intelligent enough. No, that's not necessarily the case. They might not have been exposed to it. They might have not been. There's all kinds of things. So as we start to have these conversations, start to say, well, I'd like to know that from your perspective. I'd like to, and I think that there's one of the products of whatever we want to call this world that we exist in America is presumption. Let me speak on behalf of you. Let me tell you how you should be thinking, how you should be feeling. And we don't understand how dehumanizing that is. They say, oh, you thought I don't have a mind of my own. You thought just because I'm being accommodating means I'm agreeing, right? You thought, but that's, then again, who has power? If somebody was to be culturally humble, they would say, well, David, tell me, could you please share with me, how you feel? You don't have to speak on behalf of the entire Black community.
How you feel.
Yeah. How do you feel about this?
Wow.
And so I think that's relationship building, right? That's genuine relationship building. And what we need to also come back to right now is that, I encourage people to say, you know what, you have to take care of yourself. If the last 4 years was difficult on you because of politics, because of divisive rhetoric, because of dehumanizing rhetoric, because of all of that, now maybe we need to come back to some of those conversations that we haven't had with those folks, with those people. And not that you have to have the same relationship as you had before, but if you're not there to like help educate, help teach, but like, how can we blame it when like 3 years or 4 years from now that these people are even more ignorant than they are now?
I want to thank you for being on Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. You were great today, Pardeep. If people wanted to get a hold of you, to have you work with them, come speak at an event, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
The best way is probably just to contact me via Facebook. I don't really do the Twitter thing too much, but I'm up to my friend limit. But they can definitely like just follow instant message. It's Pardeep Kaleka at Facebook. Twitter is Pardeep Kaleka. At Pardeep Kaleka.
Thanks for the information, Pardeep. And if you're listening, make sure you reach out. Follow him, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, wherever he is. Make sure you follow him. And until next time, on Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. This is David Cooks reminding you that your ability to endure is always greater than your willingness to endure.
You can do anything you put your mind to.
Thanks for tuning in to Paralysis to Purpose. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Paralysis to Purpose on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. To purchase his book, visit davidcookspeaks.com. Be sure to tune in next time for more inspiring conversations with David Cooks.
Music was my practice of hate and violence. If I wasn't out actually like committing acts of violence and like hating people on one-to-one basis, I would listen to this music, which would basically serve the same purpose.
Next time on Paralysis to Purpose.
And so that was how I maintained the lie, all of this whole suite of lies that is white nationalism and formed an identity around it.
Paralysis to purpose.